Okay, let's go. Number 1. North Sentinel Island. You're an Indian Coast Guard officer, and your orders today are unusual. Not a rescue operation, not a smuggler intercept. You're circling a small island in the Bay of Bengal at exactly 3 nautical miles, maintaining that distance with the precision of a surveyor, making sure nobody approaches from any direction. You will complete your circuit and return to port. You will never know what's watching you from the tree line. You will never know if the men with bows already spotted your vessel and decided, again, not to acknowledge that the outside world exists. According to the Indian government, that ignorance is not a failure of intelligence. It is the entire point. This is North Sentinel Island, and it is one of the most completely sealed places on Earth. No person may legally approach within 3 nautical miles of its shore. The restriction isn't a recent bureaucratic adjustment. It's enforced by the Andaman and Nicobar Protection of Aboriginal Tribes Act, backed by Indian criminal law, and maintained by decades of violent clarification delivered personally by the island's only residents, a group of people who have been here, by the best available genetic evidence, for approximately 60,000 years. The island sits in the Andaman Sea, part of India's Andaman and Nicobar archipelago, rising from the ocean floor as about 23 square miles of dense tropical jungle ringed by reef and sand. Its inhabitants are called the Sentinelese. No one outside the island speaks their language. No anthropologist has recorded their customs. No government has conducted a census. Population estimates range from 50 people to 400. A margin of uncertainty so enormous it tells you more about how little is known than about how many there are. The Indian government officially classifies them as a particularly vulnerable tribal group, which in practice means they are protected with a level of intensity normally reserved for nuclear installations. The history of that protection is written in blood and disease. In 1880, British colonial administrator Maurice Vidal Portman led an expedition to the island and kidnapped 6 Sentinelese, an elderly couple and 4 children, intending to bring them to Port Blair for study. All 6 fell immediately ill from diseases to which they had 0 immunity. The couple died within days. The 4 children were returned to the island, almost certainly carrying pathogen exposures their community had never encountered in 60 millennia of isolation. What those children told their people when they were brought back ashore is unknown. What happened to the community's immune response to whatever the children carried is also unknown. But from that point forward, the Sentinelese response to outside contact became systematic and increasingly final. A 1974 National Geographic expedition attempting friendly contact was met with arrows the moment the film crew entered the shallows. The 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, which killed over 200,000 people across the region, devastated Andaman Island communities within miles of North Sentinel. 2 days after the disaster, a helicopter dispatched to check on the island's population photographed a surviving Sentinelese man standing on the beach. He was firing arrows at the aircraft. He had survived one of the deadliest natural disasters in recorded human history. He was not interested in rescue. In November 2018, American missionary John Allen Chow paid local fishermen to boat him close to the island. He attempted contact 3 times over 2 days. On the first attempt, a Sentinelese boy fired an arrow that struck his Bible. On the second attempt, he was driven off by arrows and waiting men. On the third day, from the boat, his companions watched figures drag a body along the beach. Indian authorities discussed recovering Chow's remains. They concluded that any attempt to land would expose the Sentinelese to whatever pathogens the recovery team carried. They did not try. Chow's body remains on the island. The official explanation for the 3 nautical mile exclusion zone is humanitarian in nature. The Sentinelese have no immunity to common diseases, influenza, measles, the common cold. A single contact event could trigger an epidemic capable of wiping out their entire community within weeks. This is not theoretical. Contact-era epidemics destroyed up to 90% of some indigenous populations within a few years of sustained exposure. Isolation is protection, not imprisonment. This explanation is medically sound. It is almost certainly partially true. But the explanation doesn't fully account for the intensity of the enforcement. India has other uncontacted or minimally contacted tribal groups across the Andaman Islands, the Jarawa and Onge, people with less absolute legal perimeters and more managed engagement protocols. The 3 nautical mile marine exclusion zone around North Sentinel exceeds even international standards for uncontacted peoples. No remote acoustic or photographic study of the island has been officially commissioned, despite the fact that related Andamanese populations carry a genetic lineage that diverges from all other human populations approximately 60,000 years ago, making the Sentinelese potentially the oldest continuous human culture on Earth. The Indian government has, officially, no interest in even distant study of what may be the deepest living memory in human existence. Some researchers propose that the Sentinelese possess accumulated ecological and medicinal knowledge of their island environment that would be significant if understood from a distance. Others suggest the island's geology contains resources the government is quietly holding in reserve. A smaller school of thought holds that something happened during colonial-era contact that doesn't appear in the published historical record. Something beyond the 1880 kidnapping that changed how the Passes, British and later Indian, administration classified this specific island from unknown to permanently untouchable. What is 60,000-year-old humanity protecting in that jungle? What do they know about this specific island that makes them fight every outsider to the point of death to keep it sealed? And what does it say about the most sophisticated government on the Indian subcontinent that their considered answer, for more than a century, has been to build a wall of water around them and look away? This island's secrets are held by people who refuse to share them. The next island's secrets were buried by the people who made them. Number 2. Poveglia Island. You're a Venetian harbor official in 1793, and 2 ships have arrived at the outer lagoon under quarantine flag. Their cargo of plague has already killed several passengers. Your orders are clear. The ships do not enter Venice. They anchor at Poveglia. The sick are rowed to shore. The dead are rowed to shore. Whatever happens on that island stays on that island. You sign the documentation. You do not go with them. Nobody who goes with them ever comes back the same way they left, and the ones who don't come back at all stop mattering, officially, the moment they touch the dock. This is Poveglia Island, and it sits in the Venetian lagoon between Venice and the Lido, 17 acres of overgrown stone and soil that the Italian government has maintained in a state of enforced abandonment for decades. Nobody lives there. No tours operate. In 2014, the government attempted to lease it for private development, accepted a bid, and then canceled the agreement without explanation. The cancellation came after a bidder had been accepted. That's the part that doesn't fit standard heritage procedure. You don't accept a bid and then cancel without documented cause, unless something in the process, something in what the bidder proposed, something in the review, something found changed the government's position. No public explanation was provided. The island has remained sealed. No development timeline has been offered since. The island's recorded history begins in 421 AD, when Roman citizens fled the barbarian invasions raging across the northern peninsula and established a settlement on Poveglia's protected shores. That settlement eventually declined. For centuries, the island sat quiet in the lagoon. Then the Black Death arrived in Europe. By the 1340s, with plague killing up to 60% of Venice's population, city authorities began using Poveglia as a containment site, the dead quarantined away from the living, burned in mass graves to limit spread. The island received the dying and the dead through successive plague waves for centuries. By the time the 1793 quarantine orders were signed, directing the ships with sick passengers to Poveglia, it was already established practice stretching back 400 years. Local accounts and soil assessments suggest the island contains the remains of approximately 160,000 individuals accumulated over those centuries of use. The soil in various sections of the island reportedly approaches 50% human ash in composition. Archaeological surveys have found layers of human remains close to the surface across large sections of the property. The bones are not metaphorical. The dead of a dozen plagues are physically there, compressed into the ground beneath the overgrowth. In 1922, the Italian government repurposed the island's existing stone buildings into a psychiatric hospital. The asylum operated until 1968, receiving patients from across the Venetian region. What happened inside during those 46 years is incompletely documented. The medical records from the facility's operational period are not publicly available. A legend emerged specific enough in its detail to have spread beyond Venice into international awareness of a physician at the asylum who conducted unauthorized procedures on patients, who was eventually pushed from the hospital's bell tower, survived the fall, and died shortly afterward. The bell tower still stands on Poveglia. The legend is unverified. No named physician and no incident report appear in any public record. But the specificity of the legend, the bell tower, the procedures, the sequence of events, has persisted for decades without a traceable origin. Legends that specific without a documented source tend to be covering for something that did happen rather than something invented from nothing. The Italian government's stated position on Poveglia is preservation and public safety. The buildings are structurally compromised from decades of abandonment. The island is a heritage site requiring assessment before development can proceed. Both explanations are administratively plausible. But Italy manages dozens of structurally compromised heritage island sites across the Venetian lagoon and its coastlines. Several are open to tourism, active restoration, or development projects. Poveglia's combination of restricted status, cancelled auction, and absence of any stated development timeline is not standard heritage procedure. An entrepreneur who briefly occupied the site in the period following the 2014 interest was eventually stopped, with no formal public record explaining on what grounds the occupation was terminated. The archaeological record of Poveglia is incomplete in a way that is itself unusual. For an island with 17 centuries of human habitation and documented mass burial, the formal excavation and cataloging work one would expect from a heritage authority has not been done. There are no published findings from systematic excavation. The density of human remains in the soil has not been formally surveyed. For an island this historically significant, that absence of documentation is not oversight. It is a choice. Some researchers suggest the density of unexcavated remains is itself the deterrent that the legal and ethical complexity of what lies under Poveglia's surface is something the Italian government has decided is better left, undisturbed permanently. Others point to the asylum records, 46 years of institutional psychiatric history, currently inaccessible, in a facility whose practices during that period were never subject to external review. A minority view holds that something was found during the 1922 construction when workers dug foundations into soil that had been burning plague dead for 5 centuries that altered the island's permanent classification. What is underneath Poveglia's soil that its government will not excavate? Why was an accepted development bid cancelled with no stated reason? What did workers find in 1922 when they broke ground into 500 years of accumulated death? The Italian government sealed this island with silence. The next island was sealed with something more honest. Number 3. Ilha da Queimada Grande. You're a Brazilian Navy supply sailor in the early 1900s, approaching a small island 93 miles off the coast of Sao Paulo. You're here to resupply the lighthouse keeper, a routine rotation. The lighthouse keeps ships away from the reefs. The keeper lives alone on the island. When your launch reaches the dock, there is no one there to receive you. The silence is unusual. You call out. Nothing moves but the palms in the wind. You go ashore and follow the path toward the lighthouse. You find what you find. The Naval Command, when you report back to them, decides something permanent. No one will staff this lighthouse again. Whatever is on this island is not compatible with the continued presence of human beings. This is Ilha da Queimada Grande Snake Island, and the Brazilian government, through the Marinha do Brasil and IBAMA, Brazil's Environmental Protection Agency, controls every person who sets foot on it. Visiting without written authorization from both agencies is a criminal offense under Brazilian environmental law. The authorization is rarely granted. A small number of research teams receive annual permits. Each team is required to bring a licensed medical doctor. The visits are measured in hours and days, not weeks. Nobody stays overnight by choice. The island separated from the Brazilian mainland approximately 11,000 years ago as sea levels rose at the end of the last ice age. When it separated, it took with it a population of Bothrops insularis, the golden lancehead, pit viper, a species found nowhere else on Earth. With no ground predators and no way to reach the mainland, the population adapted over millennia to hunt birds rather than ground prey. This evolutionary pressure produced a hemotoxic venom of extraordinary potency, the most fast-acting of any pit viper in the Americas. The venom causes tissue necrosis, hemorrhaging of vital organs, and systemic failure. It can kill a human being in under 1 hour. It is also capable of beginning digestion of prey while the prey is still in flight, which is why the snake evolved it in the first place. The current population of golden lanceheads on Isla de Queimada Grande is estimated at between 2,000 and 4,000 individuals, distributed across approximately 110 acres of island terrain. In the densest sections, that approaches 1 snake per 10 square feet. Herpetologists who have completed authorized research visits describe moving through the vegetation with extreme care, checking overhead branches before stepping beneath them, unable to sit on any surface without first inspecting it. One researcher, in a published account of their visit, described the experience as navigating a field where every object is a potential loaded weapon. The lighthouse keeper's story circulates in the Marinha do Brasil with enough specificity to have become institutional memory. The keeper was found dead inside the lighthouse, multiple bites across his body. His family, arriving by boat to check on him after he missed contact, were also found dead on the path from the dock. The Navy decided immediately that no further human occupation of the island was viable. The lighthouse was automated. The version of this story that has spread internationally is largely consistent in its details across different accounts, specific enough in the lighthouse and the family that it suggests a documented incident filtered through decades of naval oral history. The Navy has not published the underlying records. The conservation explanation the government uses is legitimate on its own terms. Bothrops insularis is listed as critically endangered on the IUCN Red List. The island is its only habitat on Earth. Human presence poses a real threat to the species, but the conservation framing does not fully account for the enforcement posture. Brazil maintains other critically endangered species on restricted land without requiring dual military-civilian authorization and a mandatory on-site physician. The level of restriction applied to Ilha da Queimada Grande exceeds what comparable conservation designations require. The pharmaceutical dimension is documented, not speculative. The venom of Bothrops insularis contains a bradykinin potentiating peptide BPP-10C, first isolated in research, that contributed directly to the development of ACE inhibitors, a drug class now used daily by millions of people for blood pressure and heart failure treatment. Captopril, one of the first ACE inhibitors, derived from pit viper venom research. Current pharmaceutical investigation continues into golden lancehead venom compounds for cardiovascular and anticoagulant applications. The wild population of Bothrops insularis on Ilha da Queimada Grande is the only natural source on Earth for live specimens and fresh venom. Illegal collection has been documented. Wildlife trafficking investigators have confirmed cases of smuggled Bothrops insularis specimens. The black market price for a live golden lancehead has been reported in the thousands of dollars per individual. Who is purchasing them, and for what research purpose, is not always established in enforcement records. The Brazilian government controls all legitimate access to the island and, by extension, all legitimate access to the venom supply. This is characterized publicly as conservation enforcement. Whether it also functions as a controlled access pharmaceutical resource monopoly is a question the government has not formally addressed. What actually happened to that lighthouse keeper and his family? Why does access to a wildlife preserve require authorization from 2 federal agencies plus a physician? And who holds the benefit of being the sole legally authorized route to the world's only wild supply of a compound currently in pharmaceutical development? Britain sealed its island because nature made it lethal. The next island was sealed because Britain made it lethal themselves. Number 4. Gruinard Island. You're a British government scientist in the summer of 1942, standing on a small, uninhabited island off the northwest coast of Scotland, watching sheep die on the hillside around you. They were tethered in position before the detonation. They died within 3 days of the first bomb. Within a week, all the animals on the test grid were dead. Your reports go to the Ministry of Supply marked restricted. You note the effectiveness with clinical precision. What you understand standing here, looking at the hillside, is that you are not measuring a weapon's performance on sheep. You are measuring whether the same outcome is achievable at scale across German cattle farmland. The weapon works. The question is only whether Britain will have to use it. This is Gruinard Island, a 1.2-mile-long piece of ground off the coast of Wester Ross, Scotland, and the British government quarantined it in 1942 with warning signs posted on every beach reading, "Danger, do not land." It stayed quarantined for 48 years. The signs were there when your parents were born. They were still there when Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister. No person was permitted on Gruinard between 1942 and 1990, and the only agent the British government has ever officially admitted to testing there is anthrax. The program was called Operation Vegetarian, and the name grows more disturbing the longer you sit with it. The concept was this. Bacillus anthracis spores would be packed into linseed oil cattle cakes, the type used as supplemental feed across German farmland. 5 million of these cakes were manufactured. The plan was to drop them by aircraft over Germany's agricultural heartland, contaminate the livestock food supply, and trigger mass die-offs of cattle and sheep. The weapon was produced. The stockpile was ready. The reason German livestock did not die from airdropped anthrax cake in 1944 is not that anyone in the British War Cabinet decided it was a step too far. It is that Allied forces reached victory before the order was given. The option remained on the table until the armistice. The problem with anthrax as a weapon is that it does not expire. Bacillus anthracis forms spores that can remain dormant and viable in soil for decades under normal conditions. Documented estimates from contaminated sites range from 50 to 100 years of spore persistence. Gruinard's soil was loaded with live anthrax spores from multiple test detonations beginning in 1942. The island sat sealed and largely unmonitored for the next 4 decades. In 1981, anthrax-contaminated material washed ashore on the Scottish mainland near Gruinard Bay. Testing confirmed it had originated from the island. Sheep on the mainland coastline died. The incident forced a government reassessment that parliamentary questions had been building toward for years. Members of Parliament had been asking about the island's status throughout the 1970s, receiving answers that acknowledged the contamination while deflecting questions about remediation timelines. The 1981 mainland incident ended that deflection strategy. Decontamination began in 1986. The method was 280 tons of a formaldehyde and seawater solution pumped into the island's soil layer over multiple seasons. The top 6 inches of soil near the original bomb crater sites was physically removed, containerized, and incinerated. The process took several years. In 1990, a single lamb was placed on the island, monitored for weeks, and survived. The Ministry of Defense returned the island to the Gruinard family, the original owners from whom the government had purchased it in 1942 for the duration of the emergency. The island was officially declared clean. The official explanation is that the decontamination was effective, rigorously conducted, and confirmed by soil sample analysis across multiple sites. Formaldehyde penetration killed the spore loads. Soil removal addressed the highest concentration sites. The lamb test validated the outcome. But formaldehyde treatment of anthrax-contaminated soil has a documented limitation. It penetrates surface layers effectively, but deep soil below the treated zone is largely unaffected by standard application methods. The 1986 decontamination treated the top 6 inches. Anthrax spores can migrate downward through soil over decades of rainfall and freeze-thaw cycling. What exists below the treated layer on Gruinard Island has not been publicly assessed. The Ministry of Defense has never released the full soil analysis dataset from the 1986 to 1990 decontamination period. The data exists. It is not public. There is also the question of what else may have been tested there. The declassified Operation Vegetarian records confirm anthrax bomb detonations. They do not confirm that anthrax was the only agent evaluated on Gruinard during the war. The Ministry of Supply's biological weapons program during the same period was simultaneously investigating botulinum toxin, rinderpest virus, and other agents. What additional trials occurred on Gruinard specifically beyond what was declassified is not established in the public record. The island today is technically private property. Under current law, visitors are not legally barred. But no public access infrastructure exists, no tours operate, and the persistent scientific uncertainty around its true condition maintains the practical seal that the official quarantine signs once enforced. What is in the deep soil of Gruinard Island more than 3 decades after the official Clean Bill of Health? Why has the full analysis dataset never been released? What other agents was the Ministry of Supply developing during the same years the island was in active use? And why is an island officially declared clean in 1990 still, in practice, inaccessible today? The Soviet Union tested weapons on an empty island too. What they tested was considerably harder to contain. Number 5. Vozrozdeniya Island. You're a Soviet biologist in 1988, standing on a dock in the middle of the Aral Sea, watching colleagues load sealed containers onto barges. The containers are not labeled. The paperwork you carry says nothing about the contents. You know what's inside because you helped put it there. You've spent years on this island in facilities that appear on no unclassified Soviet map, conducting experiments that appear in no published literature, with organisms that most of the world believes are no longer being militarized by anyone. In 13 years, the sea around this dock will have shrunk so dramatically that the island will become a peninsula connected by dry land to Kazakhstan. Anyone with a vehicle will be able to drive here. There will be no guards, there will be no fence, and everything you buried on this island will be 3 hours from the nearest city by road. This is Vozrozdeniya Island, Renaissance Island, in direct translation, and it was the Soviet Union's primary open-air biological weapons testing ground for more than 50 years. The island sits in what was once the central Aral Sea, straddling the Kazakhstan-Uzbekistan border. At its peak, the Aral Sea was one of the 4 largest inland bodies of water in the world. By the early 2000s, intensive Soviet-era irrigation diversions had reduced it so severely that Vozrozdeniya ceased to be an island entirely. It is now a peninsula accessible by road. There are no checkpoints on the route to it. There are no contamination warnings posted across most of its surface. It is open ground. The Soviet biological weapons program was called Biopreparat, and it was the most extensive state-run bioweapons program in human history. At peak, it employed an estimated 60,000 scientists and support staff across dozens of facilities. Vozrozdeniya was the outdoor testing range, the place where laboratory-developed agents were evaluated under real-world field conditions. The agents tested there included Bacillus anthracis, which causes anthrax, Yersinia pestis, which causes plague, variola, major smallpox, the disease the world had eradicated from human populations by 1980, which the Soviet Union was simultaneously weaponizing in direct violation of the Biological Weapons Convention they had signed in 1972, Francisella tularensis, which causes tularemia, Brucella species, Q fever organisms, botulinum toxin, Venezuelan equine encephalitis. All of them were tested outdoors, in the open air, on Vozrozdeniya. In 1979, a production accident at the Sverdlovsk military facility, not on this island, but at a separate plant, released aerosolized anthrax spores into the surrounding urban area. A minimum of 64 people died in documented cases, though independent assessments suggest the true number was higher. The Soviets told the world the deaths were caused by contaminated meat. The CIA knew what had actually happened and said nothing publicly for over a decade. Following Sverdlovsk, the program moved to ensure better field data on anthrax performance under real atmospheric conditions. In 1988, large-scale open-air anthrax tests were conducted on Vozrozdeniya spore loads released across test grids to measure dispersion patterns, atmospheric survival rates, and lethality. These tests are documented in post-Soviet disclosures by former Biopreparat scientists, including Ken Alibek, the program's deputy director, who defected to the United States in 1992 and published a memoir titled Biohazard. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1992, the scientists evacuated. The departure was not orderly. Program records were incomplete. Some materials were destroyed, some were not. The facilities were left standing. In 2001 and 2002, a joint U.S.-Kazakh team arrived to assess what remained. They found anthrax spore containers buried in the ground, some deteriorating, some open. The Pentagon funded a neutralization operation. The identified containers were treated. The team departed. The official position from U.S. and Kazakh authorities is that the 2001 to 2002 operation successfully neutralized the identified anthrax contamination, and the site no longer poses an acute biological hazard. Here is what that framing leaves unaddressed. The team neutralized the containers they found. They did not find everything. The Soviets did not leave behind a complete inventory of what was buried on Vozrozhdeniya, because that inventory was either incomplete at the time of evacuation or classified at a level that did not transfer with the program's dissolution. The plague and smallpox testing sites were not included in the 2001 to 2002 scope. Anthrax spores have been confirmed viable in soil for periods well beyond what these deposits would represent. And the wind that blows regularly across the exposed Aral seabed carries fine soil particles from Vozrozhdeniya into populated regions of Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. The smallpox question is the one the official record has never directly answered. The Soviet program was weaponizing variola major at a time when the disease was being declared eradicated from the earth. If weaponized smallpox variants were field-tested outdoors somewhere, Vozrozhdeniya is the logical candidate. If they were tested there, the soil contains something that the global health community believes exists only in 2 certified repository facilities, one in Atlanta, one in Novosibirsk. Alibek stated in Biohazard that smallpox weaponization was a central part of the program. He did not specify which outdoor testing sites were used for smallpox evaluation. What is still in the soil of Vozrozhdeniya that the 2001 team didn't find? Where exactly were the plague and smallpox test sites, and what does it mean that the most contaminated ground in Soviet military history is currently a peninsula that anyone can drive to on an unremarkable afternoon? The Soviet Union emptied its island of weapons. The United States emptied its island of people. The difference is instructive. Number 6. Diego Garcia. You're a Chagosian fisherman in 1971, and a British official is telling you that the boat you're boarding is taking you to Mauritius for medical treatment. Your family has lived on Diego Garcia for 4 generations. Your grandparents were born on this island. You speak a Creole language that evolved here, over nearly 200 years of continuous habitation. You carry a few belongings. You have been told this is temporary. By the time you arrive in Mauritius, you will understand that no return date has been arranged. When you ask about returning, you will be told there is nothing to return to. The island you left belongs to the Americans now. In later years, a British court will call what happened to you illegal. The island will still not be returned. This is Diego Garcia, the largest island of the Chagos archipelago in the central Indian Ocean, and it is one of the most operationally significant military installations on Earth. The U.S. Naval Support Facility Diego Garcia hosts nuclear-capable aircraft, pre-positioned weapons stocks, submarine support operations, and satellite tracking infrastructure covering a full quadrant of the Indian Ocean. In both Gulf War operations, in Afghanistan, in a sustained arc of Indian Ocean military activity for over 50 years, Diego Garcia has functioned as an unsinkable aircraft carrier in the middle of the sea. The reason there are no civilian witnesses to what happens there is that the British government removed them by force between 1967 and 1973, and has spent the decades since fighting in court to decision, keep them from returning. The Chagosian people were the indigenous population of the Chagos archipelago, approximately 1,500 to 2,000 people living across Diego Garcia and surrounding islands, with documented, continuous habitation from the late 18th century. They were not temporary workers or migrants. They were a settled people with their own culture, their own Creole language, and their own ancestral connection to the land. In 1966, the United Kingdom signed an agreement with the United States to establish a military base on Diego Garcia. The agreement required a vacant island. The British made it vacant. The removal happened in stages. Chagosians who traveled to Mauritius or Seychelles for medical treatment or any other purpose were not permitted to return their passages home, were quietly cancelled. Those remaining were shipped out. The islanders' dogs, pets, working animals, animals that had lived alongside Chagosian families for generations, were rounded up by British personnel and gassed using exhaust, routed from U.S. military vehicles. The animals were killed in front of the people who owned them. Shortly afterward, those people were placed on ships and told they were leaving. A 1966 Foreign Office internal memorandum, declassified decades later, described the Chagosians as a few Tarzans or Men Fridays whose claims to the islands could be managed administratively. This was not fringe opinion within the department. It was the documented reasoning behind the policy, written in the language of British governance, circulated among the officials who made the removal happen. The military use since then has been extensive and in key areas classified. B. 52 bombers launched from Diego Garcia struck targets in Iraq in both 1991 and 2003 and in Afghanistan in 2001. The base has hosted nuclear-capable aircraft throughout its operational life. The US and UK consistently deny nuclear weapons are stored there. Neither government will confirm what is stored there, citing security requirements, which means the denial rests entirely on the word of the institutions with the most to gain from the denial. In 2008, the UK government admitted to Parliament that 2 rendition flights had landed at Diego Garcia. The island was used as a transfer point for CIA, extraordinary rendition, the secret movement of detainees, to locations outside normal legal jurisdiction. The government called these uses unauthorized. No explanation was offered for how unauthorized use of a high-security military installation was possible without official knowledge. The inquiry into what else the island was used for in the early 2000s remains incomplete in the public record. On March 8, 2014, Malaysia Airlines flight MH370 disappeared over the Indian Ocean. Diego Garcia sits approximately 2,000 miles from the aircraft's last confirmed position. The island operates a sophisticated radar and communications network with coverage across a substantial portion of the Indian Ocean. What those systems recorded on the night of March 8th has never been disclosed beyond a blanket denial that the aircraft approached the island. The data has not been released. The denial has been accepted. The Chagosians have won in British courts repeatedly. Judges have called the expulsion illegal and the government's conduct unlawful. Each time, the British government has used orders in council procedural mechanisms that override court findings without judicial review to prevent return. In 2024, the UK agreed to transfer sovereignty of the Chagos Islands to Mauritius. The military base remains. Diego Garcia itself, under the terms of the agreement, stays under Anglo-American military control. The people who were born there still cannot go home. What is the U.S. doing on Diego Garcia that required erasing an entire indigenous people from the island's legal history? What did the base's radar systems detect on March 8, 2014? What is stored in the facilities neither government will inventory? And why has a country that calls itself a democracy spent 50 years fighting in court to ensure the people it displaced can never return? The island that comes next was cleared of its people not by a government, but by the weapons themselves. Number 7. Eniwetok Atoll. You're watching from a neighboring island in November 1952, and something appears on the horizon that no human being was meant to see from a few miles away. A light rises from the ocean's surface brighter than the midday sun, expanding into a fireball that climbs into the stratosphere and forms a cloud 25 miles across. The shock wave reaches you. The heat reaches you. Your family has lived on this ring of islands for 3,000 years. You have no word in your language for what you are watching. What you are watching is the world's first hydrogen bomb, the device the Americans called Ivy Mike, and it has just vaporized the island of Elugelab, which was part of your atoll. There is no Elugelab anymore. In its place is a crater 6,240 feet across and 164 feet deep. In 30 years, U.S. officials will tell you the atoll is safe to return to. Then they will quietly revise that assessment. This is Eniwetok Atoll, in the northwestern Marshall Islands, a ring of 40 islands enclosing a central lagoon, inhabited by Marshallese people for at least 3,000 years. Their navigational culture produced some of the most sophisticated ocean reading techniques ever developed, stick charts woven from coconut fronds and shells, mapping ocean swells and island positions across the Pacific with a precision that allowed open ocean voyaging across hundreds of miles without instruments. In 1947, the United States government told the Eniwetok community they needed to vacate their islands temporarily for the good of mankind. They were relocated to Ugelang Atoll, 200 miles away, which was smaller and less capable of supporting their population. Between 1948 and 1958, the United States used Eniwetok Atoll as a nuclear and conventional weapons testing range. 43 nuclear devices were detonated there. 43 conventional weapons tests were also conducted. Operation Ivy Mike, in November 1952, produced a yield of 10.4 megatons, approximately 700 times the Hiroshima bomb, detonated simultaneously. Elugelab Island ceased to exist as a physical landmass. Subsequent tests were distributed across the atoll's remaining islands and lagoon, with little regard for what the land and water would be able to support afterward. By 1958, when testing at Eniwetok concluded, the atoll's soil contained concentrations of plutonium-239, cesium-137, and strontium-90 across multiple islands. Cleanup began in 1977. The method the U.S. government chose was consolidation. Contaminated soil, rubble, and radioactive debris from the testing areas were collected and placed into a former nuclear bomb crater on Runit Island. Then, the crater was covered with a concrete dome. The dome, officially designated the Cactus Dome, but known to Marshallese as the Runit Dome, is 358 feet in diameter and 18 inches thick. It contains approximately 95,000 cubic yards of radioactive material, including plutonium, cesium, and strontium isotopes. Construction was completed in 1980. The problem is structural in the most literal sense. The dome was built on coral, porous, water-permeable coral, not sealed bedrock. The bottom of the dome is open. There is no liner between the concrete shell and the ground beneath it. Seawater from the lagoon seeps upward through the coral foundation and directly into the waste material inside. After more than 40 years of exposure to marine conditions, the dome itself is cracking. It was not engineered for the accelerating sea level rise now underway in the Marshall Islands. The Marshallese government has been raising the alarm about the dome for years, formally demanding that the United States acknowledge responsibility for the structure it built on a territory it destroyed. The U.S. government's stated position is that the dome is a Marshall Islands problem. The U.S. acknowledges having built it. It does not acknowledge an ongoing obligation to maintain or repair it. No funds have been allocated by the U.S. for dome remediation as of the most recent assessments. In 1980, some Eniwetok residents were permitted to return to the atoll's southern islands. The northern islands, including Runit, remained restricted due to ongoing radiation levels. Independent radiation surveys have produced findings. The U.S. disputes researchers comparing measurements from certain northern atoll areas to established radiation. Benchmarks have found cesium-137 concentrations exceeding levels documented in zones of the Chernobyl exclusion area. Residents who have returned to the southern islands report elevated cancer rates. The U.S. maintains the southern islands are safe. The testing records from the full Eniwetok series remain partly classified. Data on the specific compositions and quantities of radioactive material deposited on each island during each test sequence is held in classified archives. The complete inventory of what is in the soil beyond what was collected for the dome is not publicly known. When does the dome fail? What reaches the Pacific Lagoon at Eniwetok when 95,000 cubic yards of plutonium and cesium find the water? What would the full test record show about radiation deposits that the U.S. has declined to release? And what does it mean that the people the U.S. government removed for the good of mankind were allowed back onto land that independent scientists say is not safe to inhabit? The next atoll on this list was never used for weapons. Its restriction comes from something older and stranger than government ordinance. Number 8. Palmyra Atoll. You're sailing into Palmyra's central lagoon in August 1974, and the water is the clearest you've ever anchored in. The atoll sits 1,000 miles south of Hawaii, uninhabited. The palms are dense, the lagoon is sheltered, and the reef outside is alive with fish. 2 other boats are already anchored here. You exchange pleasantries with the other sailors. You settle into the rhythm of a remote anchorage. You don't know what happened here before any of you arrived. You won't know what happens after you leave. 2 people anchored in this lagoon with you this summer will never leave at all. This is Palmyra Atoll, a U.S. unincorporated territory at 5 degrees 52 minutes north latitude, roughly 1,000 miles south of Honolulu, jointly managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Nature Conservancy as a protected wildlife refuge. Access requires a federal permit. Those permits are rarely issued to individuals outside approved research teams. No permanent human population exists on the atoll. The official reason is conservation. Palmyra hosts critical seabird colonies, undisturbed coral reef ecosystems, and green sea turtle nesting grounds. Human activity would disturb them. The older history of the atoll runs considerably deeper than conservation. Ancient Polynesian navigators used Palmyra and the surrounding Line Islands as waypoints on trans-Pacific routes for centuries before European contact. Stone fire pits, fish traps, and adzes, consistent with regular Polynesian habitation, have been documented across the atoll's islets, evidence that someone found Palmyra routinely navigable and worth returning to across a span of time that predates written records of this part of the ocean. A full archaeological inventory of the atoll has never been formally published. The artifacts exist in the record as references within research papers and internal agency documents. The complete catalog has not been released. In 1798, the American merchant vessel Betsy wrecked on Palmyra's outer reefs. Survivors reached Hawaii. In subsequent decades, ships that stopped at Palmyra for provisions reported a consistent pattern in their logs: equipment difficulties, crew tensions, an atmosphere that sailors characterized as oppressive, beyond what the physical environment explained. These accounts span different nationalities and different centuries, ranging from 19th century whalers to mid-20th century military personnel. During World War II, the U.S. constructed a military base on the atoll, stationing 6,000 soldiers at peak. After the war, the soldiers departed. The base decayed. The jungle reclaimed the cleared ground. The island fell quiet again. In August 1974, 2 boats arrived at Palmyra and anchored in the lagoon. The Seawind carried Mac and Eleanor Graham, a wealthy retired couple from San Diego who sailed for pleasure. The Iola carried Buck Walker and Jennifer Jenkins. Walker had a criminal record. Jenkins was his companion. The 4 people were aware of each other's presence and interacted occasionally over the following weeks. In early October, the Seawind was observed leaving Palmyra with Walker and Jenkins aboard. The Grahams were not on it. Mac and Eleanor Graham were never seen alive again. In 1981, 7 years after the summer of 1974, a woman walking the beach at Palmyra found a metal container partially buried in the sand. Inside were Eleanor Graham's remains. The container had been burned. Walker and Jenkins were located in Hawaii, where they had arrived on the Graham's boat. Walker was convicted of murder in 1985 and sentenced to life in prison. Jenkins was tried separately and acquitted. She later wrote a full account of the ordeal titled "And the Sea Will Tell," published in 1991, maintaining her innocence throughout. Walker maintained that Jenkins was not involved. The specific sequence of events that unfolded on Palmyra between August and October 1974, what happened to Mac Graham, how, and in what order, was never reconstructed with complete certainty during the legal proceedings. The Grahams were not the only people to come to harm at Palmyra. Sailors and researchers who have visited the atoll over the subsequent decades have described, in sailing journals, oral histories, and interviews with Pacific maritime communities, a consistent pattern: equipment failures at unusual rates, psychological disturbances among crew members, and accidents that those with experience at comparable Pacific atolls regard as statistically disproportionate. These accounts are not in official records. They form a pattern in informal documentation that begins before 1974 and continues after. The conservation justification for Palmyra's restricted status is legitimate. The seabird colonies and reef ecosystems are genuinely worth protecting, but the permit process for Palmyra is more demanding than for comparable U.S. national wildlife refuges with similar conservation profiles in the Pacific. Researchers who have navigated it have noted the intensity of the process relative to other protected sites. The ecological justification doesn't account for the discrepancy. The full Polynesian archaeological record of the atoll remains unpublished. The complete World War II history of what the military found, built, or encountered beyond the basic base infrastructure is not fully declassified. What the Nature Conservancy and Fish and Wildlife Service have found in their years of exclusive management access is not comprehensively reported in the public literature. What happened to Mac Graham in those weeks on the atoll in 1974? What does the complete Polynesian archaeological record of Palmyra actually show? Why is this particular wildlife refuge more tightly controlled than comparable sites? And what is the origin of a pattern of incidents that independent observers have documented across more than 2 centuries of Palmyra's recorded contact history. Palmyra's deaths are documented and unresolved. The next island's mystery involves a death that can't be confirmed because no one has ever established who was there. Number 9. Bouvet Island. You're a member of a Norwegian scientific expedition in April 1964, and you have just stepped onto what is formerly the most remote island on Earth. Bouvetoya sits in the South Atlantic at 54 degrees, 25 minutes south, approximately 1,600 miles from the nearest inhabited land, and roughly 1,000 miles from the coast of Antarctica. The island is almost entirely covered by glacier. There is almost nothing here, which is why what you find in a small bay on the island's northwestern coast makes no sense. There is a lifeboat. It is in good condition. It has oars. It has a copper water tank. It has basic supplies. It is not wrecked or wave damaged. It appears to have arrived here under some degree of deliberate navigation. There is no ship anywhere in surrounding waters. No maritime authority has a missing vessel report that corresponds to this boat. No expedition to Bouvet was scheduled by any government that would account for its presence. You are looking at a functioning lifeboat in working condition on the most isolated island in the world, with no explanation for how it got there. No body, no flag, no crew, no answer. When the expedition documented the lifeboat and reported it, Norwegian maritime authorities had no resolution to offer. A subsequent expedition returned to the northwestern bay and found the boat gone washed away before a full investigation could be conducted. The question of who left a lifeboat on Bouvet Island in the early 1960s has never been answered by any maritime authority, government inquiry, or published investigation. Not one explanation has ever been found. This is Bouvetoya, Norwegian territory since 1927, confirmed after a brief dispute with the United Kingdom, settled without conflict. It is a nature reserve. A Norwegian automated meteorological station operates there, transmitting data without requiring human presence. The island receives occasional scientific visits, measured in days, from Norwegian research expeditions with government authorization required. Apart from those infrequent visits, the island is unoccupied. No public access infrastructure exists. On September 22, 1979, a U.S. Vela satellite detected a double flash of light in the South Atlantic. The Vela satellites were designed to monitor compliance with the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty of 1963, detecting the specific electromagnetic signature of nuclear detonations in the atmosphere. A nuclear explosion produces a characteristic double flash, a brief initial peak, a period of darkness as the fireball expands, and a second peak. The signal recorded on September 22, 1979, matched this pattern precisely. The location was triangulated to the region around Bouvet Island and the Prince Edward Islands, approximately the zone of the Southern Ocean, with the least maritime oversight of any sea area on Earth. The Carter administration convened an interagency intelligence assessment. A science advisory panel, chaired by physicist Jack Ruina, was established. The Ruina panel concluded in 1980 that the double flash was probably not a nuclear explosion, characterizing it as a possible zoo event, meaning an internal satellite calibration artifact, rather than an external detection. The panel acknowledged it could not rule out a nuclear test entirely. A separate Defense Intelligence Agency assessment reached a different conclusion. The DIA's internal evaluation found the event was almost certainly a nuclear detonation. This DIA assessment has never been fully declassified. What is available in partial release is sufficient to establish that 2 U.S. government bodies analyzing the same Vela data reached contradictory conclusions, and the more skeptical, publicly convenient conclusion was the one made available. South Africa was developing nuclear weapons throughout the 1970s, with technical assistance from Israel, and the program was active. Both countries had motivation to conduct a test outside the monitored ranges of recognized nuclear powers. Both had naval assets capable of operating in the South Atlantic. In the years following 1979, South African officials made statements about their country's nuclear program that, depending on interpretation, are consistent with a test having been conducted that year. The South African government has never formally acknowledged a 1979 test. The Israeli government has never acknowledged assisting one. The U.S. government has never formally closed the Vela incident investigation. The double flash of September 22, 1979, remains the most significant unacknowledged possible nuclear detonation in the post-atmospheric test ban era. The combination of the 1964 lifeboat and the 1979 Vela incident does not prove that Bouvet Island is a site of classified military operations. What it establishes is that the island has been associated with two separate unresolved events in living memory, both involving things that should not have been where they were found. A lifeboat where no vessel was operating, a nuclear signature where no test was scheduled. Bouvet is not sealed in the way the other islands in this list are sealed. There is no military exclusion zone and no criminal prohibition on approach. The island is simply so remote and so inhospitable that the practical barrier to access is nearly absolute. In the 60-plus years since the lifeboat discovery, no independent investigator has been able to examine the northwestern bay where it was found. No seismological or radiation survey of the island and surrounding seafloor has been conducted in connection with the 1979 event and released into the public record. Who left a functional lifeboat on the most remote island in the world in the early 1960s? What does the full Defense Intelligence Agency assessment of the September 22, 1979, double flash actually conclude? What is in the South Atlantic, near Bouvet Island, that two separate governments have declined to acknowledge for more than 40 years? Every island in this list was sealed because of what happened on it, or what was buried in it, or what was done to the people who lived there. The last island on this list is sealed for a reason unlike any of those. It was sealed the moment it was born. Number 10, Surtsey Island. You're on an Icelandic fishing boat on the morning of November 14, 1963, south of the Westman Islands, and something is wrong with the horizon. A column of what looks like black smoke is rising from the ocean surface about 20 miles ahead. Your captain radios the Coast Guard. A research team arrives within days. What they find is not a ship on fire. What they find is a volcanic eruption breaking the surface of the North Atlantic for the first time, throwing lava and ash skyward as the seafloor rises faster than the ocean can cool it. An island is being born. You are watching it happen. Within days, the Icelandic government will designate the emerging ground a protected nature reserve. The moment it solidifies enough for a human being to stand on, you will not be allowed to. This is Surtsey Island, and fewer than 100 people have legally set foot on it since it emerged from the sea in 1963. No tourist has visited it. No journalist has stood on its shore. A small number of Icelandic scientists, authorized by government permit and bound by strict protocols, have conducted periodic research visits across 6 decades. The island has been a UNESCO World Heritage Site since 2008, which formalized the international standing of a restriction that Iceland established the moment the island cooled. The official reason is scientific. Surtsey is the most precisely controlled natural experiment in the colonization of lifeless land by living organisms ever documented, and any human contamination a seed carried in on a boot sole, a microorganism on an unwashed hand, would compromise decades of irreplaceable data. The eruption that created Surtsey began November 14, 1963, and continued until June 5, 1967. At maximum extent, the island covered approximately 1 square mile. The moment it solidified, it was sealed. Scientists watching from boats and low-flying aircraft documented the arrival of the island's first inhabitants without touching the ground themselves. Bacteria established presence within years of the eruption's end. The first vascular plant was documented in 1965. Seabirds began landing to rest in the late 1960s, began nesting by 1970, and their nutrient-rich droppings began accelerating soil formation. The island was building an ecosystem from absolutely nothing, in real time, with a research team watching from a respectful distance and recording every step. Today, Surtsey hosts 89 documented plant species, numerous invertebrate species, and a continuous seabird breeding colony that has been monitored without interruption. The island has shrunk from erosion wave action, and natural weathering have reduced it from its original 1 square mile to approximately half a square mile. Scientists estimate Surtsey will be fully submerged within a few hundred years, unless new volcanic activity adds material. The contamination protocols for authorized research visits are among the strictest applied to any field science location outside a sealed laboratory. Equipment and clothing must be inspected and cleaned before landing. Organic material of any kind, food, plant material, soil from other locations, must be strictly accounted for. Even with these measures, in 2009, a tomato plant was discovered growing on Surtsey. Investigators traced it to human feces left by a researcher who had eaten tomatoes and failed to use the island's designated waste containment system. The plant was removed immediately. The incident demonstrated that a single, unauthorized biological introduction produces a visible, measurable result within one growing season. That detail is why the protocols exist. It is also why the anomalies in the botanical record matter. Several plant species documented on Surtsey appeared earlier than current models of wind dispersal, ocean current transport, and bird-mediated seed transport would predict. Species showed up before the natural mechanisms known to carry them to remote volcanic islands should have delivered them. The explanations proposed in the scientific literature are primarily atmospheric, that airborne biological material travels by mechanisms not yet fully modeled. These explanations may be correct, but they are offered to explain deviations in the record of an island that only 100 people have ever legally visited, whose data is controlled by a small group of Icelandic researchers and their institutional collaborators, and whose complete 60-year dataset has not been published in comprehensive form available to independent analysis. The official explanation for Surtsey's restriction is genuinely straightforward. The island is sealed to protect science, not to conceal it. The data from monitoring Surtsey's ecological succession undisturbed is of real scientific value. Contamination is a real risk with documented consequences. This is not conspiracy. This is careful research methodology applied to an event that happens once in a geological era. And yet, the restriction established in 1963 has deepened with time, not relaxed. The island's full observational record, 60 years of primary data from what is essentially the best monitored, newly created place on Earth, is known in detail only by the people who conducted the monitoring. What exactly Surtsey has shown about how life begins on lifeless ground is available to the rest of us only in what those researchers have chosen to publish. What has 60 years of sealed observation revealed about how life colonizes a world that didn't exist before 1963? What grows on Surtsey ahead of schedule? And what does that mean for how we think biology travels across open ocean? And what does it mean that we sealed off an island from the moment of its creation, told ourselves it was to protect the purity of an experiment, and handed the full results to a handful of people who report back to us what they decide to share? 10 islands, 10 governments, 10 different reasons you cannot go. What connects all of them is not danger or disease or military necessity alone. What connects them is a decision made in some cases by a democracy, in some cases by a colonial administration, in some cases by a Cold War power, that some things are better off not being seen, better locked away, better left in the hands of the people who control the information, while the rest of us circle at a safe distance, waiting to be told what's there. If that pattern unsettles you the way it unsettles us, subscribe so you don't miss what we find next. Drop a comment with where you're watching from, and if you know of a forbidden island we missed, we want to hear it. Like if you made it this far.